Hello and welcome to this joint ProCon Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire webinar. I'm Umesh Desai, I'm the Chair of ProCon Leicestershire. As you're aware, ProCon has been connecting professionals in property and construction since 2000 in Leicestershire and in 2018 in Nottingham. And we're delighted that you have joined us for this afternoon's event. Today, you'll hear from John Alker, Director of Policy at UK Green Building Council, who will be discussing zero carbon policy and delve into some of the technical explanations of priorities and highlighted within the construction playbook, from setting targets for the energy use to intensity through to the measurement and reduction of embodied carbon and everything between. Also lined up, we have Wayne Bexton, Director of Carbon Reduction, Energy and Sustainability at Nottingham City Council, and Anna Dodd, Energy and Sustainability Manager at Leicester City Council, who will be talking about their respective plans and strategies to achieve net zero carbon. As always, we'll be hosting a live Q&A session at the end with assistance from Cartwright Communications, where we'll be answering your questions. If you have any question for any of them, simply type it into the box below. We'll be answering these as we go in a little while. You'll also be able to use the upvote function. If you see a particular question you'd like to know about an answer to, then please make use of this. We'll be able to make sure that we answer the questions that you're most interested in. But for now, without further ado, I'll pass you over to John.
Well, hello everybody. Nice to be here today. My name's John Alker. I'm Director of Policy and Places at the UK Green Building Council. If you don't know much about UK GBC, just very briefly, we are a charity. We've been around about 14 years. We have 500 or so members, mainly private sector organisations from across the property, construction, infrastructure sector, but we also have local authorities within the membership, academic institutions, some government agencies such as Homes England, and one or two others. So a broad church, but the sort of put together by the industry for the industry is how I like to describe it. And really, we're all about helping the sector overcome barriers to sustainability in the built environment. So we do a lot of work with government, both nationally and locally. And of course, we work with our members directly, helping to make the business case for sustainability, do a lot of leadership work and things like that. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is new homes policy, specifically how local authorities can and indeed are driving up standards in new homes and doing that largely through planning. I'm going to be referring to a publication which we've had out for several years actually, but recently underwent a sort of major refresh of. We call it our New Homes Policy Playbook. And I'm going to just sort of go through some of the key recommendations in that, and then I look forward to a discussion after the other speakers. Just a sort of a high-level introduction to what this thing is. You can see a link there actually, which I know you won't be able to click on, but it's not too difficult to remember, ukgbc.org/housing standards. If you go on that, you should be directed to a page through which you can click and download this resource. It's quite a chunky one. And it's designed, not to be necessarily read from start to finish, but to be utilised. And what you'll see is basically a very kind of large suite of recommendations for local authorities on how they can largely use the planning system to drive up standards in new homes. The majority of the playbook focuses on carbon, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But there are other sections in there as well, actually, on a number of other issues, including mitigating overheating risk, which is very important as we increase air tightness and so on, and also acoustics. And we're planning to add other sections in the coming months. So I'm going to just take you through the 5 key sections of the playbook. And you can see them there listed 1 to 5. What I wanted to also flag, and you'll see this in the slides that follow, is that for each one of those sections, we've made sort of 2 types of recommendations. Firstly, we've made what we call suggestions around minimum requirements, and those are kind of does what it says on the tin, really. But those are recommendations for standards that we think all local authorities could implement, and indeed should implement ASAP, in order to bring standards up to a higher level. But we've also, for each of those sections, suggested what we've called stretching requirements. And that's because there's such a appetite from many local authorities now, having set or declared climate emergency, to really figure out how on earth do we meet these targets. And many are wanting to go much further, much faster than was the case even just a couple of years ago. And we felt we needed to be able to kind of respond to that and provide a more kind of aspirational sort of standard for those that are keen to go further. We still think that the recommendations there in terms of those stretch sort of requirements are kind of feasible and viable, but the viability point in particular is something that the local authorities are going to have to kind of take into consideration in terms of their own geographical context, in terms of land values, and so on. But those sort of stretching requirements are much more at the kind of leading edge side of things, as you will see. The little graphic there is just from an organisation called the London Energy Transformation Initiative that some of you may have come across, and it's just quite a sort of neat way of encapsulating sort of what we mean by net zero carbon. But what we mean by net zero carbon really is the kind of sum total of the components that I'm going to take through today. Reducing energy demand in the first place, certainly in terms of the operation, but also increasingly in terms of the carbon that goes into the construction in the first place, making sure that we're actually kind of closing the performance gap. So what we deliver is as much as possible what was designed. That obviously that any energy that is being used is low carbon or renewable energy, and zero carbon balance refers to then closing the gap on any residual energy use, and that gets us into the realm of offsetting, which I will come on to. So I'm conscious that in terms of the audience, many of you probably coming from the industry side of things, perhaps a few local authorities as well, and indeed local authority colleagues on the panel. I think that although my comments are policy focused, and I'm a policy person, I'm not a technical person, to flag that early on. I think what this also kind of can be used for is an indication of where leaders in the industry are at in terms of best practice. So I think if policy is not necessarily your thing, I think that's something to sort of bear in mind as well. So the first section, reducing energy demand, and I'm not going to go through and read all of this kind of word for word. You can access the report, and those of a more technical nature than me can get into a lot more detail in the report itself. But you'll see the sort of two sections here. So as a minimum, we've recommended local authorities go to a 31% improvement on Part L. And what's important to say here, this may ring a bell for you, this quite specific percentage reduction. This is what government has now committed to do nationally through the next Part L uplift. Our recommendations here preceded that, but actually we're kind of mindful of that change that was coming. So this, in a way, is going to get superseded by national policy in terms of that sort of minimum standard nationally, which I think is a good thing. Something, though, that is still outstanding in terms of exactly where central government is going to land on this is the question of having a fabric energy efficiency standard. And we feel very strongly that this should be a fabric first approach. So that is something that local authorities can take a leadership position on. And something as well that central government has, I think, been dragging its heels on a little bit is ensuring not just that there's this kind of percentage improvement on a notional kind of notional building, but that we're actually moving to a situation of measuring real energy performance. So we recommend that also there should be a reporting of energy use intensity using the metric that you see there. So as I say, fortunately, that kind of minimum recommendation is hopefully soon going to be relatively defunct as national policy sort of catches up with us. The stretching requirement, though, really does go much further than where national policy is at the moment. And you'll see there in the stretching requirements for those local authorities that are really up for this, a switch to that kilowatt hours per metre squared per year metric, and an energy use target proposal of 70 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year or less operational energy use, excluding renewable energy contribution. And that's regulated and unregulated energy, which is really, really important. And I think what local authorities should be doing as well is signal that it doesn't end there, that is something that needs to be tightened over time. And there are those in the industry that are already advocating a 35 kilowatt hour per metre squared per year, really cutting edge practice. So that's certainly the sort of direction of travel. Alongside that, there should be very high levels of energy efficiency in terms of space heat demand. That metric there has been recommended by the Committee on Climate Change, and really important that compliance is demonstrated using a recognised methodology. I'm moving on to reducing embodied carbon, an issue of growing importance and pretty much no national policy on this topic. And it is only really at the moment local authorities that are driving this. You may be aware of the New London Plan, which does something similar. So as a minimum, we think that local authorities should require all developments to at least demonstrate that they have considered how to reduce embodied carbon, and that major developments should calculate embodied carbon using a nationally recognised methodology. So that isn't to say you must reduce it by X amount, but it is to say you have to get a really good understanding now of what your embodied carbon, or as it says there, whole life cycle carbon, which is slightly broader, what your responsibilities are. But for those that want to go further, those stretching requirements would be that not just major developments, but all developments calculate whole life cycle carbon emissions, and that major development should actually be required to hit a specific target. And again, this is something that is an issue of much debate in the industry at the moment in terms of what best practice is and what should be hit for different building types and so on. And we've taken a lead from REBA and others and recommended that that 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per metre squared or less is an appropriate target for the embodied carbon in terms of the modules that you see there. But that is pretty stretching, we think. And again, that's something that could be signalled to become more stretching over time. And probably all developments, not just major developments, should in time have a target to reduce embodied carbon. Next up, measuring in-use performance. As I said, really important to sort of close the performance gap. And again, something that is recognised by central government, but arguably not enough being done. So as a minimum, we think that developers should have to demonstrate that some principles of kind of a soft landing and closing of the performance gap, have been followed. But in terms of going further as a stretch, local authorities could be more specific and prescriptive about the particular approach and kind of framework that has been used. And you see the example there of the BISRIA framework. Secondly, and this could be a sort of either or, but I think this is really, really kind of interesting. The idea that local authorities could demand that all developments put in place a recognised monitoring regime to enable post-occupancy evaluation on in a larger development, for example, on a proportion of the dwellings for a period of time. And this is something which has begun in London. It's something that is happening in pockets elsewhere. So for example, Milton Keynes are doing this. And I think this is really interesting because I mean, yes, there are kind of data issues to overcome, but I think this is really interesting because this, more than anything, I think can provide that kind of reputational driver for developers to ensure that the developments that are being built are as intended, and it can frankly call out those that are poor quality. Next up, low carbon energy supply. Obviously really crucial that we reduce energy use as much as possible, but clearly there's always going to be some, and so that needs to be decarbonised. Quite a complex area, this one. As a minimum, we think the time has come that there should basically be no fossil fuel combustion on site in new developments. It just does not seem to be consistent with a climate emergency that we are still putting in fossil fuels to new development. Of course, there's always going to be the odd site that there may be some sort of reason that there's absolutely kind of no viable alternative, so it kind of leaves that ajar slightly. We think that all developments need to be considering what the on-site renewable contribution is going to be, and we have recommended that using a metric of percentage of footprint, that there should be a PV requirement, again, unless there's some very specific reason why that is not practical or viable. And major developments, of course, should be thinking about the wider area in terms of how they support or plug into energy networks. For those that then want to go further, I kind of all of the above can apply, but there could also then be a sort of specific requirement that major developments match their total energy demand through renewable capacity storage and smart controls. So that's kind of be the sort of gold standard in terms of a low carbon energy supply policy. Really important that if that is going to be followed, then that goes hand in hand with the stretching requirements set out under reducing energy demand in the first place. As I say, just to ensure that that fabric first policy and that energy hierarchy is followed, that you reduce energy first and then you decarbonize. And then finally, this area which can be quite sort of controversial, we called it zero carbon balance, but the kind of shorthand might be offsets. And we have recommended that, again, as a minimum, all developments should be required to offset residual carbon emissions from regulated energy, and that would be over a sort of 30-year lifetime, and based on a specific pounds per ton of CO2, which would be set by the local authority, and based on I mean, we've said they're kind of regional precedent, but could be based on a sort of range of factors. Realistically, this is in effect like a carbon tax. So we're sort of saying, call a spade, and say that that is a carbon tax that is designed to ensure that developers are doing as much as possible to ensure that component of what they of offset is as small as it practically can be. And certainly in terms of operational energy, as opposed to embodied, that is really getting smaller all the time. And we really need to get to a point where there's simply no need to be offsetting any operational energy, because we've reduced so much in the first place, and then we have decarbonized. But we have said that there could be a situation in which developers make up that sort of shortfall by some sort of funding of a carbon reduction project locally, working in conjunction with the local planning authority on something that is meaningful and robust in the local area. In terms of stretching requirement, really this just goes kind of further and says that all developments could be offsetting not just regulated emissions, but also unregulated. And going even further would be then offsetting emissions from embodied carbon, because at the moment, probably, really kind of leading practice in terms of reducing embodied carbon might see a 40 to 50% reduction in embodied carbon compared to a sort of, benchmark business as usual. And quite obviously that leaves a very significant amount of carbon unaccounted for. And in terms of embodied carbon, we're not going to get to net zero in construction, let alone whole life, in the very near future, unless there is an offsetting component to that. So that's my slides for now. I hope that was of some interest, and I look forward to the discussion shortly. Thanks very much.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm Wayne Bexton, Director of Carbon Reduction, Energy and Sustainability at Nottingham City Council. I'm going to take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our carbon neutral 2028 ambitions, roadmap, and some of the work we've done to date to set ourselves on the path for that ambitious target. So I'll just move over to why carbon neutral. So we're feeling the impact as a city is the fundamental. Fuel poverty issues, extreme weather events that are being flagged in insurance claims and such like, air quality in the city, albeit in a good place in regards to other core cities. And we've obviously seen recently the real importance through COVID-19 of the importance of green space, the critical nature of green space. So those things are those local impacts, coupled with obviously all the national, international landscape and everything we hear more and more regularly. That's set us on our path for carbon neutral. So we are aiming to be the first carbon neutral city in the UK by 2028. And we've got a roadmap now in place for achieving that. Just as a little bit of an overview, I'll just whiz on to a next slide, which hopefully just gives a snapshot of our emissions breakdown. So you can see that across those three key cornerstones, industry and commercial, domestic and transport, you can see what's happened since 2005 and up to the latest data we have. So as a whole, we've reduced our emissions by 41% from a 2005 baseline. So fundamentally, excellent. We're building on solid foundations for our 2028 ambition, and we've obviously set out on that journey. You can see industry and commercial have very much come down, profiled down. So that's been a lot of hard work with partners across the city, but also in the amount of energy used and energy efficiency, but also the renewable energy assets we've got in place as well, coupled with the way industry and commercial works with the city as a whole. We then got domestic. Similarly, it's followed a downward trajectory, which is great, and again a lot of retrofit work underway. But also working with residents and citizens from an education perspective. And then transport's the one that stayed pretty static. And again, something across other core cities, we've probably seen an upward trend in some respects, but we've, despite putting in the tram network, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, sustainable transport infrastructure that's integrated with each other, we have seen that remain static. And obviously we want to shift that trend in coming years and really build on some of the infrastructure we've put in place. So that's our emission. So solid foundations, emissions breakdown as a bit of an overview, and obviously lots of information that underpins those columns. But just moving on to local energy projects making the difference. And I was keen to just show some of the energy specific projects that fundamentally link into our wider carbon neutral action plan. And we're already proud to say that a quarter of the energy demand of the city is generated from renewables within the city boundary. And that's both private and public sector owned initiatives that are going on in and around the city as a whole. And there's a few examples there, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, but V2G, capacity planning, obviously the links to planning guidance are fundamental. So how we marry together both economic regeneration, but also carbon neutral aspirations is a national topic and agenda at the moment. And crucially, and I touched on it very briefly, domestic retrofit and what we do in that space to ensure those homes are fit for the future and fit for the standards that we want to see. So just a few, I always like to give a few case studies, a few quick case studies, whistle stop tour, because we've got a short amount of time. But solar carports, these are one for me, such a fundamental and that we're utilising in Nottingham. So we've got car parking space, let's give it another use. And particularly as we transition into an electric vehicle dominated sector, we could install charging infrastructure alongside some of these canopies as well. So it's utilizing the car parking space. It's a structure that enables other advantages, so protecting the surface and range shelter, sun shelter, advertising space underneath those canopies, but also generating a significant amount of power that can be used locally or put back into the grid. And again, we've got some fantastic case studies in Nottingham how this works. Coupled with one of our canopies, you can see we've put in place battery storage as well. So this is a battery trial we've put in place to manage those flows of energy. So we'll store excess energy in the day, utilize it at night. It's a simple methodology, and we've piloted Sonnen batteries, as you can see from the data on Ken Martin Leisure Centre there, as a bit of a pilot, working really well. And I'll touch on the larger scale battery storage we're putting in place as well. But for managing flows, that's obviously going to be quite key. Fuel cell program, this was all pinned around air quality, which has been focused predominantly on transport. What we said is buildings have a part to play. So our fuel cell program is seen as replacing gas boilers with fuel cells, receiving just a gas feed and pushing out heat and power into the building in question, obviously limiting flue outputs. So that's the advantage, that we see a better air quality as a result, but also a reduction in the amount of any fossil fuel required at the front end of that process. So limiting the amount of gas required from the network. Key to this is it's expensive, used widely in Europe, but it's an expensive technology. So we're proving a concept, and we're wanting then to drive down costs to enable this to be a more standard rollout. We've done this in conjunction initially with DEFRA to offset those prohibitive costs in the first instance, and we hope to have some real live results from that pilot in the not too distant future. Vehicle to grid, again, you can see working with partners across Europe, key for this one, making sure that we've got something that's really linked in with how others are planning on a wider international scale, and obviously this one being across Europe. Vehicle to grid is all around utilising those energy flows in the most efficient way possible. So we have an electric vehicle fleet. The fleet we're utilising for this exercise is around about 40 Nissan Leafs. At the end of the day, when they come in, typically they've still got 30% charge, 20-30% charge analysis shows in those batteries. They plug into bidirectional charging units, as the diagram shows, decharge into a central megawatt, just under a megawatt battery, and that battery has been simultaneously topped up with solar PV across our depot site through the day. At that peak time in the evening, 5-6 o'clock, that battery then is able to trade with grid, and that generates as an income from that process. And then through the night, those vehicles charge up again when tariff rates are cheapest to do so, and so the cycle can recommence. This model, we think, would work for anyone with a fleet of around about 10 vehicles or more at the moment, and a solid business case on the back of that. And again, there'll be more findings through the summer on how that's worked, and you can see all the partners we've worked with to make this happen. So Energy Sprung, as you can see, is a methodology for tackling our domestic retrofit, which is going to be a significant challenge. Fuel poverty aligned to this, so fundamental we grasp this challenge and deliver on it. So the Energy Sprung methodology is a deep retrofit, so it's external cladding, solar PV, changes to the internal shape of a property even, and smart monitoring, plus other things bolted on as well, depending on specific circumstance. We've modelled our housing stock, both public and private, across the city. We have about 10 archetypes, so we know at one end we've got to go for that deep retrofit. At the other end of those archetypes, we might be able to do something hydrogen as a lighter touch to achieve net zero. The deep retrofit model is expensive, and we need to see that those prices reduce as the supply chain matures and the volume increases. And we're starting to see that shift in the marketplace now. And we've got a profile of around 1,000 properties in Nottingham that we are delivering over the next 18 months. And after that, we'd love to see a sustainable model for us to drive forward without the requirement for grant and subsidy. Water self-supply, key on our net zero journey is looking at water as well, something that's not really considered when we're looking at carbon neutrality, energy, and other angles are explored in more detail. But we are a water self-supply organisation in Nottingham City Council, one of only 2 councils in the country to have pursued that registration, which is a long-term approach. Essentially, it saves us money, so we get water at the wholesale rate, but also we can really target efficiencies around water and how it's supplied into the city. And the Innovation Gateway, so where we are partnering with a top-tier collaboration across the country to look at innovations around sustainability. The only local authority member, there's Tesco, RBS, Heathrow, so some big players in there who are looking at the sustainability challenge, and that's where we have our Dragon's Den style pitch day to bring those innovations forward and make sure they are fit for the challenges that are common across this agenda. And just finally then, just to whiz through our emissions pathway. So I touched on what the emissions were. You can see the black line on the screen on the graph there is where we've got to date with that 40+% reduction in CO2 emissions. You see the trajectories we need to go on. So the message here is there's a lot to do. We've got a roadmap to achieve it. We've taken some of the low-hanging fruit, and now's the time to push on using legislation and technological advancements to make this a reality. And as such, as you can see from our carbon neutral action plan, we've got those core component areas with actions across each to ensure we achieve our objective and ensure we are pushing government to go further and faster and put things in place for us to do that and make sure we've got the ability locally to have that national impact. And just finally, the action plan and its management is broadly 273 actions across 10 themes, as you can see, and it's not just us. So the key message here is it's citywide. So city partners have also committed to this agenda with the universities on board and big business across the city. We can't do this alone. We want to be in the driving seat, but it's got to be a collaboration across that city landscape. We have an implementation group. We've got our CN28 board, chaired by our deputy leader. And I think crucially is the governance around how this works and how we manage it longer term. And you can see quarterly reporting, communication, engagement with citizens, and an annual review. So all those bits that maybe fall out of the side of what we're doing and some of those tangible case studies, but are so crucial to making sure this knits together, aligns with our bigger aspirations, and that people can see the outputs, understand what we're doing, understand the landscape we're working in, and how we're on the path to achieve our significant ambition and target. That's the Whistle Stop Tour. Thank you very much. You can see my Twitter handle there, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present Leicester's Climate Strategy and Action Plan this afternoon. And Leicester has a long history of working on environmental issues, and we did have a climate change strategy way back in the 1990s with targets which were to reduce 50% of our emissions by 2025, and that has already happened. But actually what we're talking about now is something which is much more challenging for us all looking at the climate emergency. So we are committed to addressing the climate emergency, as many local authorities are, and we were one of the early local authorities to sign up to this in February 2019. And this was really based on two things at the time: the IPCC global warming report that came out, which said that talked about global warming of 1.5 degrees and the tipping point caused by that, and the Paris Agreement requiring us to keep within a 1.5 degree temperature rise. And also at the time, a really strong campaign by Extinction Rebellion nationally to encourage all local authorities to sign up and declare a climate emergency. So we were one of the early ones to do so, and really now the challenge around carbon reduction and adaptation is stronger than it's ever been. So we started then in 2019 by looking at what we could do in-house as a local authority and what were the key actions we could influence and change within our practices and work. And then in the autumn of 2019, we held a climate emergency conversation, which ran from November 2019 through to February 2020, just finished before the pandemic started. So that climate emergency conversation was based around looking at deliberative democratic processes and involving people in a new way. So we had a number of tools which we used to do that: an online dialogue discussion forum, conversation packs, an online survey, and most importantly, 2 assemblies which were representative of people in Leicester. So we had a climate assembly, which put together a cross section of Leicester's population, and a young people's assembly, which was representative of the younger population based in secondary schools. So that meant that we then had, from that, the outcomes of that process were thousands of comments and ideas that came forward from people, but most of all, a strong mandate for the local authority to take action on the climate emergency and to start acting and taking action to address both carbon reduction and adaptation in all that we do. So the climate strategy we then created following the consultation process, and that strategy states the ambition for the council to be net zero by 2030, but it's clear that and for the city to be so too, but it's clear in stating this that we need to be doing this with support of national government and other partners. And that is really a critical message, that this is not something that any local authority can do on its own. We only manage or have control over 3% of Leicester's carbon emissions. So it's something that we'll need to all get involved in, every sector of life. And the strategy identifies that new development will need to be carbon neutral as soon as possible, and ideally create a positive, a net positive energy contribution. So there's that opportunity there with new development to look at how that can positively impact on our carbon across the city. So the challenges are for us all of how we get to net zero. And so in terms of the council, we are leading by example with a strategy and action plan, which has over 100 actions in it and is currently operating. And I think for us, there are 3 key actions that are relating to our influencing of development on the city. And we're currently looking at creating a carbon neutral roadmap study. And the purpose of this study is to develop and communicate a clear set of actions needed between now and 2030, including their scale and timing of implementation, and it'll guide the work of us and our partners to work out how we can deliver programmes of action to try and achieve the very ambitious 2030 target, including engaging with central government to seek support from them. So that's the first of those actions that we're doing now. The second is a roadmap for our own operational estate, looking at how we're going to decarbonise all our operational buildings, and we're currently putting together a programme to survey those buildings to do that. And the third is a sustainable construction toolkit for the authority, which will look at our own construction, both in housing, in capital projects that we run with schools and in other buildings like business units that we construct, about how those buildings, when we develop them, can be as near carbon neutral as possible. So there's some actions from us. In addition, there is the local plan process that is currently underway. So our local plan process has ambitious targets and deadlines, and leading by example. We're hoping to encourage other authorities, from the local authority perspective, encourage other partners to look at doing the same in terms of their building development. And ACON are currently conducting a technical study for the local plan, which is looking at sustainable design and construction and policies, and how the local plan might be able to create opportunities for sustainable design and construction going forward. And the next step in that planning process is that the policies will be amended in line with the consultation at that technical study, and then there'll be a further statutory consultation. And if you'd like to be notified of further consultations, please contact Planning Policy. So what are the next steps for us now? We're going to carry on working with partners. We're looking at what partnership process we might put in place to work across the authority and beyond, and work with all people interested in the development of Leicester and the future of Leicester, and how we create a sustainable low carbon city. We're looking at creating funding opportunities. We've just been successful with a £25 million bid under the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund, and that fund will be used to look at decarbonising key schools and corporate buildings, City Council, and look at making those buildings low carbon. We're also looking at other funding, because that is a drop in the ocean of the funding that will be required, which we'll find as we develop the citywide roadmap. It's a huge challenge. And we'll continue to deliver and develop the action plan and take opportunities to innovate and be creative around new actions we can take as a local authority. Thank you.
Huge thanks to all of our speakers today for joining us and sharing some really interesting insights from all of their different perspectives there. And it's a pleasure, of course, to be joined now by Anna, Wayne and John as well, who are here to answer your questions over the next kind of 15 minutes or so. So if you haven't already typed a question in for them, please do take the opportunity to pop it into the Q&A box below, and we'll put as many to them as we possibly can over the next 15 minutes or so. I hope you're prepared. Right then, so let's get stuck into the Q&A. John, this first one is for you. You mentioned that there's a real appetite for local authorities to be improving faster than ever before. How many of these local authorities would you hope to see aiming for those stretching requirements that you mentioned in your presentation? Oh, I don't think we can hear you, John. Can you try unmuting yourself and popping yourself back on for us? Oh no, I don't think we can hear you. Oh, this is the first time we've ever had a technical hitch on any of our ProCon webinars. We've done so well to get through a year. We'll come back to you, John. If you'd like to try having a go at reconnecting, that would be brilliant. We'll move on to Wayne, though, for this question. One of the observations you noted was how the emissions from transport have remained fairly static. What initiatives are Nottingham City Council looking at to mitigate this?
Yeah, really good question. I think transport's one that's been probably a bit of a not trended, or a bit of a shock in the direction of travel in those emissions. So we've done a lot in the city. So the tram network, we've deployed charging infrastructure with the office low emission vehicles, funding for the wider D2N2 area as well. So that network's integrated, and we've obviously tried to embed sustainable travel corridors, walking, cycling, integrate those with the trams and the bus, and obviously the rail station that sits at the heart of the city centre. We think now the trend's moving, so we think there's been some positives through COVID, as you may imagine, with people travelling less. What we need to do is make sure we capture those in the right way. People are coming back into the city centre, which is fantastic. We need to make sure they can access the city in that way, in that sustainable way from a transport perspective. We're also trialling some really innovative stuff on the fringes, so those last mile journeys into the city centre. So for instance, the tram at night could we utilise that for those last mile journeys and stop those vehicle movements right into the heart of the city? And I think the data next year we're hoping will show that trend in the right direction, and we'll be sure to report on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, I know that John's just tried leaving and coming back in again.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. There we go. The age-old turn it off and on again trick has worked.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So yes, the question...
It gave me time to think about your question, which I've never been asked before, actually, which is it's a very good one. You asked how many I expected to kind of go for well,
that you'd hope to see. Maybe
yeah,
not expect, but hope.
So the first thing to say is that, obviously thinking about planning, as colleagues on the panel know, the process of integrating these sort of policies into planning can take kind of eons, and obviously all local authorities are all at very different stages on a continual kind of refresh of kind of planning cycles. So that's kind of there's no consistency there really. That's kind of challenging in its own right. I think what I'd probably say is, if you kind of look at all those authorities that have signed up to a climate emergency, which is well over half of all local authorities, that's probably even out of date saying well over half. It may well have gone north of that. Those authorities need to get to grips with emissions from new buildings. Otherwise, there's absolutely no chance that they're going to meet the targets that they've set out, because those are the easiest emissions to get to grips with, and they're not that easy. So that's what I would hope, but that will take time. Unfortunately, national policy, I don't think national policy is ever going to keep pace with leading local authority policy in terms of level of ambition, but it is now starting to move for the first time in a long time. So even for those local authorities that, with all due respect, may be laggards, national policy is actually going to kind of pull up the bar on everybody anyway.
Fantastic. Very good answer. Yeah, good that you had a little bit of time to think about it as well, I suppose. There's the bonus of technology issues. Anna, let's come to you with this next one. Wayne spoke about collaboration within the city and the wider D2N2 area. Is there anything in whether neighbouring councils like, Nottingham and Leicester should join forces to help each other become carbon neutral as well, would you say?
Yes, indeed. There's been a long process of local authorities working together across the East Midlands region and beyond, really. So, there are networks of different cities and local authorities doing things. And indeed, we're meeting a colleague of Wayne's in the next few weeks. So there's also work happening via D2N2 and Leicestershire LEP. The LEPs are working through the Midlands Energy Hub, which runs out of Nottingham. And so there's a good network across the whole West and East Midlands on looking at the low carbon agenda with those enterprise councils. So yes, I think it's really, really critical to what we do. I'm sure Wayne's nodding away there and not reinventing the wheel. And I was really fascinated by Wayne's Innovation Hub. In Leicester, we're working locally with partners. We've had a workshop last week to bring partners together to look at the climate emergency and what we can actually do, because the City Council only makes up about 4% of the city's emissions. And so, it's a huge thing for us all, developers, industry, everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. Collaboration is the word of the day, I believe. Now, John, this question is for you, and it's come from Peter Conboy. What is the UK GBC view on the accuracy of embodied carbon data that's currently available that needs to be fed into the RICS lifetime carbon model? Most materials don't yet have environmental product declarations, and there appears to be a gap, particularly with the embodied carbon data on M&E, for example.
Yeah, hi Peter. I can always rely on Igloo to ask a difficult question. I can't actually see that now because when I logged out and in again, I lost all the previous stuff. But no, that's just an excuse because I'm not an embodied carbon data techie. But I'm reading between the lines, Peter's experience, perhaps some challenges in terms of accuracy of that data. I think my first point would probably be that relatively speaking, the whole world of embodied carbon is a bit of a new-ish discipline, and the industry is still very much getting its head around it. So there's always going to be, a kind of, a development curve there in terms of accuracy. That's not to say that obviously it can't and shouldn't improve. And one of the reasons is that has not been driven by policy at all, certainly nationally, and only a smattering kind of locally, GLA being probably a notable exception. So unless we're actually starting to require developers at the very least to start measuring embodied carbon, then we don't stand a chance really of improving the data around it. The other point I would make though is that, and this is probably a sort of argument for, I wouldn't say not worrying about the accuracy of the data, but just a sort of a reflection on that, is that there are certain things that we just know to be true. So we know that steel and concrete have a very high embodied carbon content, and there are efforts afoot in terms of those kind of global industries to decarbonize, and that's absolutely critical. But we know that is the case at the moment. So there are certain sort of design choices that we are confronted with, regardless of the very specific accuracy around sort of certain products. And so there's a big challenge there around things like moving to timber, and there's a whole kind of debate, around that. There's also things that can be done, which again we just know are a good thing. Using less of any material, regardless of the specific embodied carbon content of that material, is a good thing. And those at the kind of leading edge, demonstrating that for example, removing kind of false ceilings, and kind of letting occupiers decide what they want to do about that, is a very good thing to be done, rather than assuming that everything has to look the same.
Thank you. Hopefully that answered your question for you, Peter. Thank you. Now, Wayne, this next one for you. You mentioned vehicle to grid. What kind of organisations would be able to get involved with this? Because maybe it could be something that those in our audience with maybe a smaller fleet of vehicles might be able to take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got the findings due to come out probably the end of the summer, when we've had several months of this being in practice and delivered across our test bed. So it's an Interreg Northwest Europe funded project. So ours is one of 9 case studies across Europe. So there'll be a lot of information there for businesses. And what we hope is it does then prove that concept, and we'll happily then pass that on to other local authorities, businesses, to say, look, this is how we think this revenue stacking model can work for you and your fleet, and what size storage, etc. you'd need. And I think that's the way. I mean, it links to what John's just described really about the integration of technologies. I think part of that is going to impact on what buildings look like. So, okay, let's utilize the energy and the transport and link those together from a smart city perspective, something that we're really keen on enhancing in the coming years.
Absolutely. Now, time is already flying away with us. We've got time for a few more questions though. So if you do want to put any to Anna, John or Wayne, please do type them into the Q&A box and we'll try and get through as many as we can. This next one though is for you, Anna, from Lisa Farnsworth. Wayne mentioned that water management is a key part of Nottingham's strategy. Does Leicester have a similar view, and are there any plans to join up thinking with energy and water so that we can further reduce carbon by using recycled rainwater, for example?
Thank you. It's absolutely critical that we address the water use. Just having had no rain for however long now, you can see that's the issue. We have in the past done quite a lot in terms of grey water management on parks and golf courses and buildings. So it is critical to address it, and we are looking at doing a drought plan and also looking at grey water in our sustainable construction work and moving forward in that way. So, but we haven't as yet. We have looked at the idea of doing the water being our own self-supply like Nottingham have, but haven't gone down that route as yet.
Very good, thank you. Now we've got time for a couple of final ones. This one's for you, John. How would you say, we've done quite well not mentioning COVID too much today actually, but I'm afraid this one is going to reference the pandemic. So how has the pandemic impacted on the commitments local authorities are making when it comes to carbon reduction? Naturally, one of the impacts has been less travel because we've all been working from home. So are local authorities seeing that as a potential kickstarter for those carbon neutrality targets maybe?
That sounds more like a question for Anna or Wayne, to be honest. But I mean, I think in my engagement with local authorities, it's not in any way dented the ambition. I think I think COVID obviously is going to have has had and will have a major fallout in terms of socioeconomic disparities and so on. So I think it sharpens the lens even more so on the importance of, in the jargon, a kind of a just transition to ensure that, we absolutely bring socioeconomic benefits as well as environmental through the net zero transition.
Wayne, Anna, would either of you like to speak from your respective councils?
Yes, from our perspective, we had got our action plan in place when COVID hit. Many of the actions have just proceeded. Some that were community-based and involved doing more activities with communities have not. But, our transport actions, we've taken advantage of the COVID situation and put in extra cycle lanes and used the opportunities of having a less busy city to work to our advantage in that way. I think it hasn't, I would say, in the local authority sector, it hasn't lessened the aspiration to move as fast as we can. And actually, we've only got 9 years till 2030. So actually, we can't be waiting around. We're moving forward.
Wayne, you were nodding.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely agree with Anna, and John's sentiments as far as just rebasing maybe how we consider what city centres look like. We've certainly embedded carbon neutral within our recovery plan as a city, which is now being enacted. So that is really important that those carbon neutral actions have transposed over into the recovery plan. So we're seeing that joined up approach. We're also then considering across the city our own buildings and building use. It's going to change inevitably. And how can we collaborate, make sure we get the best use of buildings if they become more of a collaboration space, if working becomes more of a hybrid approach. We've also got the crucial nature of Broadmarsh in the city centre, which no doubt people will be aware of. There's been a big consultation on that, what that Broadmarsh site looks like post it being a shopping centre. And the responses have been overwhelmingly pushing towards something with green at the heart. So a green recovery at its heart, and obviously open space as part of that. And I've no doubt that'll be a key player as we look to put that in place in the next few years.
I'd imagine so. And you've kind of preempted my final question, because we like to look forwards if we can at the end of these webinars. So I was going to ask both Anna and Wayne, what kind of changes can people of Leicester and Nottingham expect to be seeing kind of imminently? What's in the pipeline for the two cities? Anna, I'll come to you first.
Right, okay. Well, our own council housing, there's new council housing being built that's of a 70% more efficient than Part L. Still got a way to go to meet John's things, but moving in the right direction. There's lots of transport initiatives coming forward. There's a new carbon neutral bus station being constructed. So you can expect to see quite a lot of changes happening in place in the city. And we've got £25 million from the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund. So 55 of our schools are going to be decarbonised through that process.
Oh, fantastic to hear. What about you, Wayne?
Yeah, lots going on in the city, and a lot of those grant funds that have come out through Green Homes grants to local authorities, social housing decarbonisation demonstrator, lots of acronyms, and obviously the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund. We've got a lot of money coming out, so probably getting on for £100 million worth of spend over the next 2 years on that decarbonisation in and around the public sector estate. Couple that with what we're doing across with those other sectors, commercial, education establishments, and their own commitments to CN28. I think we're going to see some quite visible changes to what the city centre looks like. I touched on Broadmarsh and how that might start to appear in the future. And I know just over the last 12 months, so really COVID hasn't slowed us down. Over the last 12 months, the city centre and the appearance of the city is changing, and I'm pleased to say the carbon neutral influence has been embedded through that. So people are seeing more renewable energy technologies, people are seeing green space and enhanced green space, people are seeing certain things maybe not happening like they used to, and that's an educational tool in itself, Danielle. So we're starting to see, again, more questions coming from residents and citizens, and from a positive perspective, how can they get involved? So I think the whole momentum is going to continue over the next 12 months and beyond.
Oh, fantastic. Exciting times ahead. And I like the fact that we've ended on a nice positive note. That was really good. Thank you so much, all three of you. But now that's it for the Q&A. Thank you as well to anyone who put questions in. I'm going to hand over to Umesh, who is going to bring today's webinar to a close.
Thanks, Danielle. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you to you, John, Wayne, and Anna, for taking your time to speak to us this afternoon and sharing your expertise and insight into such an important topic. If you are not a member of ProCon and wish to join us, please do get in touch. Our contact information can easily be found on both the Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire websites and on the confirmation emails sent to you for this webinar. Our next webinar will be taking place in May, and we'll cover the subject of workplace and office remodeling. So keep an eye out for these for the inboxes, for the information on how you can save yourself a place as well. We'll be sending out details very soon. But for now, have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you next time.